You may or may not know that most of your houseplants are actually climbers, and in their natural habitat they will be climbing up the trees all the way to the top of the tree canopy. You may have just brought a plant from a plant shop that you might consider a trading plant, where in matter of fact it probably is actually a climber. Knowing this, we can make our houseplants a lot happier by recreating their natural habitat at home with moss bowls. Now, if you are like me, you may have seen this guy, Sydney plant guy, who lives in Australia and has the most amazing moss poles. If you're like me, you're in the UK and you look at his videos and cry yourself to sleep because you think your plants are never going to be as great as his. We do have to remember that the Australian climate is totally different to the UK climate. However, we can still recreate this natural habitat for our plants at home. So this is my UK version of moss poles and how to make them and how to maintain them. Let's go through what you will need. First of all, some sphagnum moss. I really like using this moss for the moss pole. Then you will have some cable ties, chicken wire, a strong metal pole for stability. Acetate. It is important to find one that is firm but malleable, so it will hold its shape a lot better. You will also need a hole punch or a hole maker. I'm going to the extreme and using a soldering iron, as this can make really clean holes through the plastic. And of course, some scissors. So the first thing you're going to want to do is rehydrate your moss. Now, a lot of your moss will be dehydrated and squished together into this block. It's very easy to rehydrate. You just need to pop this in a bowl and add some water to it. Now, I've added a little bit of seaweed fertilizer into this water just so the moss is retaining some nutrients in itself for the plant when it's attached to this moss pole in the future. We're just going to fill up the bowl and we're going to leave the moss for a good 10 minutes on the side to soak up. Whilst the moss is soaking up, we can construct our actual moss bowl. I tend to try and buy acetate in the larger sheets rather than the smaller sheets, so when I extend it, it means there's less joints for the moss pole to become unstable. A really good bonus about making your own moss bowls is that you can create thicker ones than you can buy, and that means the moss will actually stay a lot more hydrated for longer and won't dry out as quick. I'm gonna very wonkily cut this sheet in half, and this means then we have two lots of poles ready to go. The next step would just to be putting holes along each side of the moss pole. I also would recommend putting holes at the top and bottom, so if you put your moss pole either way, when you connect up you can cable tie the two together for that extra stability. I've just turned on the soldering iron, and it's always important to have a wet sponge with you to wipe off any excess plastic when you are burning it. This sponge isn't sopping wet, but it's damp and retaining some water, which will help clean off any plastic when you use it. Now with the soldering iron, we can very easily create some holes through this plastic. Now we have our acetate with these holes in. It's definitely worth checking up on your moss and seeing it has absorbed all of that water. You might find you need to rotate it and add a bit more water in there for the moss to rehydrate itself. You may just still need another 5 minutes and then it'll be ready to go. Let's move on to cutting some chicken wire ready for our moss pole. So a good thing to do is to measure out chicken wire to the length of your acetate and then cut it to size. I tend to try and bend how big I want this moss pole to be, and I will measure how many squares across. I think it's going to be about there. Now I'm going to sit down for this one. We have got our chicken wire and our moss pole back. We are going to construct the moss pole now. First do this by tying cable ties to the chicken wire. It's a fiddliest bit getting the first kind of few bends in. But once it's in and it becomes so much easier. Now it is starting to form the D shape that you all know and love. We're going to start putting our now rehydrated moss in the moss bowl. Holding the bottom and pushing in from the top means you can stuff it without it coming out the back. I find D-shaped moss poles a lot more successful than your classic, than the moss poles that Sydney plant guy uses, only because the D-shaped moss pole can hold the moisture in for a lot longer, and that is what's key to a successful moss pole. I'm going to take this Warrior Queen and take it out of its pot as carefully as possible. Wow, look at those roots. I take this Velcro tape off. I always try to keep my aeroids wrapped in moss so they can produce the aerial roots. Anthuriums love to stay moist, I have found. So this has been good practice for me. We are going to attach our Anthurium. I can reuse this Velcro tape to the moss pole itself. Just making sure it's so secure on this moss pole. I'm going to put 2 lots of Velcro tape on, and I will put some moss back over that node because I really would love that root to find the moss pole, like so. So now it is attached. Now the whole point of a moss pole is that you are extending the pot space and growing space. I'm going to squish it on in there. Like so. Then we have got our specialised Anthurium compost to pack and load into this pot. So I'm trying to go into the back of this pot. I'm compacting the soil in quite heavy. It just means the pole itself will be wedged in this pot. If you can lift up the pole without the pot falling off, you have done a great job. The pole should stand up on its own. If you are making a moss pole in a ginormous form, which you will do eventually, this is where this pole comes in. And what you would do is push it down at the back, and where we have made these holes in the back of the pole, we are able to then cable tie these 2 poles together. This creates a greater stability for your moss pole without it falling over. So that is my Warrior Queen now on a pole. Let's see how it does on this pole. I think it will probably throw a little bit of a hissy fit, but I'll hold out and I think it's going to do really, really great. So let's now move on to the care on moss poles. You may have noticed that on top of all my moss poles, there are water bottles that I have drunk from and left. I find this the best way of watering moss poles. So grabbing yourself a empty plastic bottle, and then we do cut some holes at the top for the water to drip through. This then gets filled with water, and the reason I left a little bit at the top is so the bottle doesn't tip out of the moss pole, because I have had that quite a few times and I tell you now, it is not pretty. So when this bottle is filled, it goes upside down and placed into the moss pole. Now the moss acts kind of like a wick in a candle. It will absorb the water from the bottle when it needs it. The water can last in the bottle for some time if the moss is already really, really wet. What happens is then this will slowly trickle down all the way to the bottom of your plant and water it that way. When filling up my bottle, I always add a little bit of seaweed fertilizer and a little bit of tap safe, as it provides that nutrients for my moss pole. By trying to keep your moss poles as moist as possible and being situed under a grow light really helps your moss to actually come alive. A lot of my moss poles you'll see are actually green because the moss loves it and it actually is growing, which is great. If you feel like your plant isn't producing an aerial root into the moss pole, a way I try to encourage that is to put moss around each node as it grows to keep that moist by spraying it with a sprayer. You'll eventually see aerial roots will grow out of the nodes and head into the moss pole. Once it's in the moss pole, you're fine. You can remove the moss around the node. I try to refill my bottles at least once a week, but if the temperature of my house is a lot colder, they're going to take a lot longer to dry out. At that point, I do a little squeeze test and I will squeeze my moss pole, and if the moss is drying out, you'll hear that crunch, that crispiness, and at that point I will then fill up my bottle to rehydrate it. Moss can repel water rather than soaking water. A good tip I tend to try and get in the habit of is to spray my moss poles just ever so slightly before I put the bottle of water at the top. This means that because I have sprayed the moss before watering it, the moss has had that couple of minutes to soak up the water and rehydrate, and then it will absorb all of the water that is being fed to it rather than repelling. To summarize, moss poles are a really great way to make your plants happy and to recreate their natural habitat. You're extending the growth space that your plants have, and this will encourage these bigger leaves to appear. If you want to see my entire moss pole collection, you can see this video right here, and I'll see you there. Bye, wee lovers, bye.